The funny thing about humiliation is that people only enjoy it when they think there's no price attached. I didn't know those words would become the last lesson the Whitmore family ever learned the easy way. The July sun hung high over the backyard, turning the air warm and heavy enough to make the ice melt faster than people could refill their drinks. Laughter drifted across the lawn. Country music played softly from hidden speakers. Kids ran through sprinklers. On the surface, it looked like the kind of family gathering you'd see in a magazine advertisement for the perfect American summer. But perfect is a dangerous word. Most disasters look ordinary right before they happen. My name is Cole Bennett. I'm 44 years old, and on that Saturday afternoon, I was standing beside a folding table covered with paper plates and half-finished desserts while my wife prepared to embarrass me in front of nearly everyone she cared about. Looking back, the warning signs had been there for years. The jokes, the comments, the little smiles exchanged whenever I entered a room. Nobody comes right out and declares war on someone they think is beneath them. They do something worse. They stop treating that person like they matter. The Whitmore family had mastered that art. Harold Whitmore, my father-in-law, stood near the grill wearing a polo shirt with the Apex Industrial logo stitched over the pocket. He loved that logo, loved talking about the company, loved reminding everyone that his management position gave him influence. His son, Travis, wasn't much different. Neither was Victoria. They all carried themselves with the confidence of people who believe they belong near power. The irony was almost enough to make me smile. Almost. I stood quietly with a bottle of water in my hand, while conversations floated around me like radio stations I hadn't chosen. Nobody asked what I thought. Nobody cared. That had become normal. Victoria was standing near the patio surrounded by relatives and coworkers, holding court like she always did. Her white summer dress caught the sunlight. Her smile came easily. People leaned closer when she spoke. She enjoyed attention the way some people enjoy coffee. It energized her. I watched her laugh at something Travis said. Then her eyes found me across the yard. For a second, I thought she might come over. Instead, her smile changed. Sharper, colder, the kind of smile that usually meant trouble. "There he is," she announced loudly enough for half the backyard to hear. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. I felt dozens of eyes settle on me. Everyone keeps asking what Cole actually does all day. More laughter followed. Not cruel enough to shock anyone. Just enough to sting. The kind of laughter that hides behind the excuse of being harmless fun. I didn't react. That disappointed them. People hoping for entertainment hate when their target refuses to perform. Victoria stepped closer. "Seriously," she continued. "Maybe one day he'll surprise us all and finally get a real job." A few relatives chuckled. Someone raised a glass. Harold grinned, so hard his cheeks looked ready to split. The old version of me might have defended myself. The old version of me might have argued. But age teaches you something valuable. When people are determined to misunderstand you, explanations become a waste of oxygen. So I stayed silent. That only encouraged them. Victoria picked up a plastic bucket sitting beside the patio. It contained cloudy water left over from cleaning outdoor furniture earlier that afternoon. She looked at me. Then she looked at the crowd. Maybe this will help him fit the role everyone already thinks he plays. More laughter. Then, before anyone could second-guess the moment, she tipped the bucket. Cool water splashed across the front of my shirt and jeans. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't painful. But humiliation rarely depends on force. It depends on witnesses. For a second, the entire backyard exploded with laughter. Glasses clinked. People doubled over. Someone actually applauded. Water dripped from my sleeves onto the grass. The music kept playing. The sun kept shining. And every person watching assumed they were witnessing the most embarrassing moment of my life. Victoria smiled proudly. Harold shook his head as if I deserved it. Travis nearly spilled his beer from laughing so hard. I slowly looked down at my soaked shirt, then back at my wife. The laughter continued, but something was already changing. Not in me, in them. They just didn't know it yet. I met Victoria's eyes and asked one simple question. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Her smile widened immediately. She thought it was surrender. She thought it was weakness. She thought she had already won. What none of them realized was that at 6:12 that morning, an email had arrived in my inbox. And by the end of the day, nobody in that backyard would ever look at me the same way again. The laughter did not stop immediately. People rarely abandon a performance they are enjoying. Water continued dripping from the edge of my sleeve onto the grass, while conversations slowly returned to life around me. A few relatives shook their heads as if I had somehow earned what happened. Others avoided eye contact altogether. That was always the easiest path. If you pretend not to see something, you never have to decide whether it is right or wrong. I reached for a paper napkin from the table and calmly wiped a few drops from my wrist. Victoria was still smiling. Harold was already retelling the moment to a group near the grill, adding details that had not happened because reality was never enough for him. He preferred stories that made him look important. The strange thing was that none of it surprised me anymore. People often ask when a marriage starts to fall apart. They expect a dramatic answer. A betrayal. A secret. A fight. But most marriages die one small moment at a time. A dismissive comment. An eye roll. A joke at your expense that everyone else finds funny. Then another. Then another. Until one day the person standing beside you no longer sees you at all. Victoria and I had been married for 12 years. 12 summers. 12 Christmas mornings. 12 anniversaries marked by photographs and restaurant reservations and polite smiles. From the outside, we looked successful. Inside, something different had been happening. I noticed it years before she did. Respect has a sound when it leaves a room. Most people never learn to hear it. I did. The first time it happened was at a company dinner nearly 6 years earlier. Someone had asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Victoria laughed and said, "Cole specializes in staying mysterious." Everyone chuckled. I smiled. She squeezed my hand under the table. It seemed harmless. Then the comments became more frequent. Then they became sharper. Somewhere along the way, the joke became my identity. I never corrected anyone. That part confused people. They assumed silence meant weakness. They assumed silence meant I had nothing worth saying. The truth was simpler. I stopped caring about proving myself to people who had already made up their minds. Across the yard, Travis was showing photographs from a recent business conference. Every image featured an Apex Industrial logo somewhere in the background. He loved reminding people where he worked. So did Harold. So did Victoria. It had become a family tradition. Their careers were not just jobs. They were status symbols. Proof they belonged in rooms that mattered. The irony sat so close to the surface that sometimes it felt physically painful not to laugh. Victoria walked back toward me carrying a fresh drink. Not an apology. Not concern. Just confidence. "You are awfully quiet," she said. "Thinking about getting revenge?" Her friends laughed. I looked at her for a moment. The woman standing in front of me barely resembled the woman I married. The woman I married used to sit with me on a tiny apartment balcony eating takeout after midnight. She used to believe success meant building something together. Somewhere along the road, that definition changed. "No," I said calmly. "I was just thinking." "That sounds dangerous," one of her cousins joked. More laughter followed. I nodded as if they had said something clever. Then I looked beyond them toward the line of trees bordering the property. The black SUVs had not arrived yet. The timing mattered. Everything depended on timing. Victoria took a sip from her glass. "You know," she said, "sometimes I wonder what you would do without me." The question hung in the air. Several people turned toward us. Waiting. Watching. Hoping. I almost answered. Instead, I smiled. Not because the question was funny. Because earlier that morning, at exactly 6:12, my phone had vibrated while the house was still quiet. One email. 7 words in the subject line. "Everything is ready for your review, sir." Nothing more. Nothing less. I had read it twice while drinking coffee alone in the kitchen. Then I closed the message and continued my morning exactly as planned. Because sometimes the strongest move is doing nothing until the right moment arrives. Victoria interpreted my silence the same way everyone else did. She mistook patience for surrender. Around us, the party continued. Music drifted through the warm afternoon air. Ice clinked inside glasses. Children laughed near the sprinklers. Everything looked normal. But normal can disappear faster than people realize. And somewhere beyond the neighborhood entrance, a convoy of black vehicles had already started moving in our direction. The first SUV rolled past the entrance and disappeared behind a row of maple trees. Then a second followed. Then a third. The vehicles moved slowly, deliberately, the way expensive things tend to move when they know nobody can stop them. Around the backyard, conversations began to shift. People noticed. They always do. Attention is magnetic when status appears. Harold was the first to react. He lowered his drink and narrowed his eyes toward the driveway. "That looks like a corporate convoy," he said. The excitement in his voice was impossible to miss. Travis immediately turned to look. Maybe somebody important is coming through the neighborhood. Somebody important. The phrase almost made me laugh. Victoria finally followed their gaze. Her expression brightened instantly. The same thing happened to several of her coworkers. They recognized the vehicles, not because they had ever ridden inside them, but because they had seen them arrive at executive events. Suddenly nobody cared about me anymore. The center of gravity shifted. Every conversation leaned toward the driveway. Every face turned in the same direction. It was remarkable how quickly people abandon one source of entertainment when a more attractive opportunity appears. Victoria stepped closer to the patio railing. "No way," she said quietly. "Do you think someone from corporate is actually coming here?" Travis grinned. Maybe they heard Dad was hosting. Harold laughed louder than necessary. I would not be surprised. Nobody challenged him. Nobody ever did. The Whitmores had spent years convincing themselves they occupied a special place inside Apex. The company had become part of their identity. They wore the logos, quoted executives, repeated internal talking points like scripture. Every promotion became a family celebration. Every new title became evidence of personal greatness. What none of them understood was that proximity to power and possession of power are very different things. One can disappear overnight. The other rarely does. More guests drifted toward the front section of the property. Some adjusted their shirts. Others checked their appearance using phone screens. A few even started discussing which executives might be inside the vehicles. The speculation spread quickly. Regional directors, senior vice presidents, board members. Everyone had a theory. Nobody had the correct answer. I remained exactly where I was. Quiet. Motionless. Forgotten again. That suited me perfectly. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the black paint as the convoy entered the long driveway. Tires rolled slowly across the pavement. Engines hummed softly before coming to a stop. The entire backyard seemed to pause. Even the music felt quieter somehow. A door opened. Then another. Several professionally dressed individuals stepped out first. Conversations immediately dropped into whispers. Then the final rear door opened. Richard Lawson emerged wearing a navy suit despite the summer heat. Instantly, recognition spread through the crowd. Some people inhaled sharply. Others straightened their posture. Harold nearly spilled his drink. "That is Richard Lawson," he said. Nobody needed confirmation. Every employee at Apex knew exactly who he was. Richard was not merely an executive. He was the public face of the company. Magazine covers. I noticed Victoria smoothing her dress. Her coworkers did the same. Everyone suddenly wanted to make a good impression. Human nature rarely changes. Richard began walking toward the backyard. His pace remained steady, professional, focused. Several employees instinctively moved forward to greet him. He acknowledged them politely without slowing down. Harold stepped ahead of the group, extending his hand before Richard even reached him. "Mr. Lawson," he said enthusiastically. "What an honor." Harold Whitmore. Richard glanced at the hand briefly, then continued walking. Not rudely, not dramatically. The distance between Richard and me could not have been more than 30 feet, yet it felt like the entire backyard was holding its breath for every step. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the children who had been running through the yard seemed to sense something unusual was happening. Richard crossed the patio with the calm confidence of a man who spent his life walking into important rooms. Except this was not a boardroom. It was a family barbecue where nearly everyone believed they understood exactly how the world worked. They believed titles defined value. They believed appearances revealed truth. Most of all, they believed they knew who I was. Richard stopped directly in front of me. The silence became almost physical. I could hear the distant hum of traffic beyond the neighborhood entrance. I could hear ice shifting inside a forgotten glass somewhere behind me. Richard offered a small professional smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bennett," he said. "I hope we are not interrupting your day." For a moment nobody reacted. The words simply floated there. Then confusion began spreading through the crowd. I saw it in their faces. Victoria blinked twice. Travis frowned. Harold looked as though he had misheard something. Richard extended his hand. I shook it. "Everything on schedule?" I asked. "Yes, sir," Richard replied immediately. "The board is waiting for your final approval." The words sir landed harder than any speech could have. I watched Victoria's expression change. Not dramatically. Slowly. Like someone trying to solve a puzzle while realizing half the pieces had been missing the entire time. Around us, whispers began. Questions. Uncertainty. Nobody knew what to say because none of them understood the conversation they were hearing. Harold finally stepped forward. "Mr. Lawson," he said with a nervous laugh. "I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding." Richard turned politely. "There has not been any misunderstanding." Harold's smile weakened. "You know Cole?" Richard looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Of course I know Mr. Bennett." He paused briefly before continuing. "I work for him." The silence that followed felt endless. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody reached for another joke. The air itself seemed to change. Victoria stared at me, then at Richard, then back at me. Her confidence was evaporating in real time. Travis looked completely lost. One of Victoria's co-workers actually took a step backward. Richard remained perfectly calm. He had no interest in humiliating anyone. He was simply stating facts. Facts have a way of causing damage all by themselves. Harold cleared his throat. "I am sorry," he said carefully. "Work for him in what capacity?" Richard folded his hands in front of him. "As Chief Executive Officer of Apex Industrial." A murmur spread through the crowd. Several people exchanged confused looks. Others simply stared at me. I could almost see them reviewing years of assumptions inside their heads. Every joke, every comment, every dismissive glance. Suddenly those memories looked very different. Victoria's face had gone pale. "What is he talking about?" she asked quietly. I looked at her. For the first time all afternoon, there was no sarcasm in her voice. No superiority. No performance. Only uncertainty. Richard answered before I could. "Mr. Bennett founded Apex Industrial. He remains majority owner and chairman of the board." Nobody spoke. A paper plate slipped from someone's hand and landed softly on the grass. Somewhere near the back of the yard, a soda can tipped over. Tiny ordinary sounds became strangely noticeable when an entire group of people forgot how to breathe. Victoria stared at me as though she had never seen me before. The truth was she had seen me every day for 12 years. She simply never bothered to look closely. Richard reached into a leather portfolio one of his associates had carried from the vehicle. He removed several documents and handed them to me. "The acquisition package is ready for review," he said. "We only need your signature." I accepted the folder. Around us, nobody cared about the paperwork. They cared about the reality that had just shattered everything they thought they knew. And as I looked across the backyard at the faces that had laughed only minutes earlier, I realized something important. The hardest part was not revealing the truth. The hardest part was watching people understand it. Understanding arrived in stages. First came confusion, then disbelief, then the slow, painful realization that the story people had been telling themselves for years was wrong. I watched it happen across dozens of faces at once. It was like watching a room lose electricity one light bulb at a time. Nobody knew where to look. Some stared at Richard. Others stared at me. A few looked down at the grass as though answers might be hiding there. Victoria stood completely still. The confidence she had worn all afternoon was gone. In its place was something I had not seen in years. Uncertainty. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, then stopped. Whatever words she had planned no longer fit the situation. Harold recovered first. People like Harold always try to regain control of a conversation. It is instinct. "Well," he said with a nervous laugh, "this is certainly unexpected." Nobody joined him. The laugh died alone. Richard remained composed. His associates stood quietly nearby holding folders and tablets. To them, this was not a dramatic reveal. It was a normal business meeting that happened to be taking place in an unusual location. "Mr. Bennett," Richard said, "the board reviewed the final projections this morning. The acquisition increases market share by 17% across 3 regions. We are ready to move forward whenever you approve." Every sentence made the silence heavier. Those were not the words people used with a retired husband everyone thought spent his days doing nothing. Those were the words used with someone making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Travis looked visibly uncomfortable. "Acquisition?" he asked. Richard glanced toward him politely. "The largest expansion Apex has completed in 8 years." Another wave of silence rolled through the backyard. Several relatives exchanged nervous looks. I could almost hear their thoughts. They were trying to reconcile 2 versions of reality. The version they had believed, and the version standing directly in front of them. The human mind does not enjoy that process. It fights it. It searches for loopholes. Victoria finally spoke. Why did you never tell me? Her voice was barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air. Everyone wanted the answer. I looked at her for a moment before responding. You never asked. The truth landed harder than anger ever could. Because it was true. During 12 years of marriage, she had asked about titles, income, career paths, promotions, visibility. She had asked what people thought. She had asked what looked impressive. She had never asked what mattered to me. Somewhere along the way, she stopped being curious about the person standing beside her. Richard quietly handed me a pen. I opened the folder and reviewed several pages. The paperwork itself was routine. Numbers, signatures, approvals. Business rarely looks dramatic when it changes lives. Most of the time it looks like paper. I signed the final page and returned the folder. Done, I said. Richard nodded. Congratulations, sir. The board will be pleased. Then he added something that changed the atmosphere again. The employee restructuring review begins Monday. Several Apex employees immediately looked concerned. Harold included. He tried to hide it. Failed. Restructuring review? He repeated. Richard answered matter-of-factly. Every major acquisition requires operational evaluation, leadership performance, department efficiency, long-term strategic alignment. Nobody missed the implication. Nobody needed it explained. Suddenly job titles did not feel quite as permanent. Suddenly status seemed less secure than it had 30 minutes earlier. I noticed Victoria staring at the water stains still visible on my shirt. Earlier they had made her laugh. Now she could barely look at them. Funny how quickly perspective changes. A warm breeze moved through the backyard carrying the scent of cut grass and barbecue smoke. The same afternoon continued. The same sun remained overhead. Yet everything felt different. Because the most powerful shifts rarely happen when the world changes. They happen when people finally see the world clearly. Richard checked his watch. We should head back, he said. Then he paused. Unless there is anything else you need from us, Mr. Bennett. Around us, every eye turned toward me once again. And for the first time all day, nobody was laughing. Richard's question lingered in the air. Unless there is anything else you need from us, Mr. Bennett. The silence that followed felt longer than it actually was. A few seconds at most. Yet for the people standing around that backyard, it probably felt like minutes. Because they were waiting to see what kind of man I really was. The version they had created in their minds had vanished. Now they were staring at a stranger. I glanced around the gathering. Faces that had been full of confidence an hour earlier now carried caution. Nobody seemed sure where they stood anymore. That happens when people discover they have been reading the wrong map. No, I finally said. You have already done everything I asked. Richard nodded once. Very good, sir. He turned toward his team, but before they could leave, a voice interrupted. Wait. It was Victoria. Every head turned toward her. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes fixed on me. Not Richard. Not the executives. Me. Cole, she said quietly. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding. The question sounded different from the others. Not defensive. Not arrogant. Desperate. I looked at her and saw something unfamiliar. For years, she had spoken from a position of certainty. She always seemed convinced she understood every situation before it unfolded. Now that certainty was gone, what part seems unclear? I asked. Her mouth opened slightly, closed again. She looked around as if searching for support. None came. Harold stared at the ground. Travis avoided eye contact. The co-workers who had laughed earlier suddenly found the lawn fascinating. Nobody wanted to become part of the conversation. Victoria folded her arms. Not out of confidence. Out of discomfort. You never told me any of this. That is true. Why? She asked again. The answer was simpler than she expected. Because I wanted a life, not an audience. The words settled over the group. Richard remained silent. He understood there were conversations no executive could participate in. Some things belong to business. Others belong to people. I do not understand, Victoria said. You built all of this and then pretended to be someone else. I shook my head. No, I never pretended to be anyone. I was exactly who I claimed to be. A breeze moved through the backyard, lifting the edge of a tablecloth near the dessert station. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet the atmosphere felt completely different now. You let everyone think. Victoria stopped. She could not finish the sentence. Think what? I asked gently. Her eyes dropped. She knew the answer. Everyone did. Think he was unsuccessful. Think he lacked ambition. Think he depended on her. Think he deserved the jokes. Think he deserved the disrespect. Nobody said those words aloud. They did not have to. The truth was standing between us already. Harold finally cleared his throat. Cole, he began. If there has been any misunderstanding over the years, I looked at him. The sentence died immediately. Not because I interrupted him. Because he heard how weak it sounded. Misunderstanding was not the correct word. People do not accidentally spend years looking down on someone. That requires intention. Richard checked his watch again. His team was waiting. Business was finished. Human consequences were just beginning. We should go, he said quietly. Safe travels, I replied. He extended his hand one final time. We shook. Then he and the others started walking back toward the vehicles. Nobody rushed to introduce themselves anymore. Nobody chased after photographs. Nobody tried to impress anyone. The performance was over. The convoy pulled away a few minutes later, disappearing beyond the trees just as calmly as it had arrived. The moment the final vehicle vanished, a strange stillness settled over the property. It reminded me of the silence after a storm passes. Not destruction, clarity. The sky looks the same, but everyone knows something important has changed. I looked down at the faint water stains still visible across my shirt. Earlier, they had been the source of laughter. Now nobody seemed willing to mention them. Funny how quickly symbols change meaning. I glanced toward Victoria one last time. She looked like someone trying to remember exactly where everything started going wrong. The problem was that some answers arrive years too late. And deep down, I had a feeling the hardest conversation of the entire day had not happened yet. After the convoy disappeared beyond the trees, nobody seemed interested in food anymore. Plates sat untouched on folding tables. Drinks warmed in the afternoon heat. Conversations that normally would have filled the backyard had been replaced by scattered whispers. The Whitmore family gathering continued technically, but the atmosphere felt completely different. The illusion that had supported it was gone. I walked toward a nearby table and picked up a bottle of water. The plastic crackled softly in my hand. Simple sounds felt unusually loud now. Victoria watched me from across the patio. She looked like someone standing in the ruins of a story she had believed for years. Not because I had changed, because her assumptions had. Harold finally approached first. He moved slower than usual, less certain. Cole, he said carefully, there are some things we should probably discuss. I unscrewed the bottle cap. Such as, he hesitated. That alone told me everything. Harold Whitmore never hesitated. For years he had opinions about everything. Promotions, careers, leadership, success, other people, especially me. Now the words seemed harder to find. I think maybe we judged some situations incorrectly. I took a sip of water before answering. Maybe. The response was not hostile. It did not need to be. Truth rarely requires extra decoration. Harold nodded awkwardly. Then he looked toward the house. Then the yard. Anywhere except directly at me. You understand how this looks. I do. People made assumptions. They did. Another silence followed. He wanted forgiveness to arrive before accountability. Most people do. The problem is that life rarely works that way. Across the patio, Travis was speaking quietly with two co-workers from Apex. Earlier they had looked confident. Now they looked worried. Every few moments they glanced in my direction. Not because I was threatening them. Because they were suddenly aware that actions have consequences. Corporate restructuring reviews were normal business practice. Yet after years of arrogance, even ordinary processes felt dangerous. Victoria slowly walked over. Harold immediately stepped aside. Whatever conversation he wanted could wait. Can we talk? She asked. Her voice lacked the sharp edge I had grown used to hearing. I nodded. We moved toward the far side of the yard where the noise was softer. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the grass. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then she finally broke the silence. Was any of it real? She asked. What? Us? The question surprised me. Not because it was unfair. Because it was honest. Of course it was real, I said. At least for me. She looked down. Then why keep something this important secret? I studied her face. 12 years of memories existed between us. Good years. Difficult years. Ordinary years. Relationships rarely collapse from one moment. They erode. Because I wanted someone to care about who I was, I answered. Not what I owned. Her eyes filled with regret. Not dramatic regret. Quiet regret. The kind that arrives when a person finally understands their own choices. I never thought, she began. Then stopped. I know, I said gently. That was the problem. Another silence settled between us. Somewhere behind the house, laughter from a neighboring yard drifted across the fence. Life continuing normally somewhere else. The water, she said softly. I should not have done that. No, I agreed. You should not have. She nodded once. There was no defense left. No explanation. No joke capable of fixing it. Some moments permanently reveal who people have become. This had been one of them. Back near the patio, several guests were beginning to leave. Excuses appeared quickly when discomfort arrived. Early morning tomorrow. Long drive home. Things to do. People always find reasons. I watched them gather keys and handbags and unfinished conversations. The party was ending long before sunset. Victoria followed my gaze. Everything is different now. I looked across the yard one final time. The decorations. The tables. The family members avoiding eye contact. The places where laughter had echoed only hours earlier. No, I said quietly. Everything is exactly the same. She frowned slightly. I continued. The only difference is that now everyone can see it. The last guests were gone before the sun disappeared. Folding chairs sat empty across the lawn. Half-finished drinks remained on tables. The celebration that had started with laughter ended with silence. Funny how quickly a room changes when truth walks in. I stood near the patio for a while, watching the evening light settle across the yard. The water stains on my shirt had almost dried completely. Earlier, they had been a source of amusement. Now they felt like a reminder. Not of humiliation, of clarity. Some lessons arrived quietly. Victoria remained near the house. She looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing a story you believed about someone was never true. Harold left without another speech. Travis left without another joke. For once, nobody seemed interested in proving anything. The performance was over. The masks had become too heavy to carry. As the sky turned orange and gold, I thought about the years behind me. The business. The marriage. The choices. People assume vindication feels like victory. Sometimes it does, but more often it feels like peace. Not because your critics finally understand your value, because you stop needing them to. That was the realization waiting for me at the end of that day. The truth had never changed. My bank accounts had not changed. My ownership had not changed. My accomplishments had not changed. The only thing that changed was visibility. Everyone else finally saw what had always been there. Victoria slowly walked toward me one last time. Her eyes were red from hours of reflection. I do not know how to fix this, she admitted. There was no pride left in her voice. Only honesty. I appreciated that. Some things are fixed with words, I said quietly. Some things are fixed with actions. And some things teach us lessons we carry forward. She nodded. I could tell she understood. Neither of us pretended everything would suddenly return to normal. Life is not a movie. Consequences do not disappear because someone finally says the right thing. Respect takes years to build and moments to lose. We stood there for a while without speaking. The evening breeze moved through the trees. The neighborhood grew quieter. Somewhere in the distance, a porch light switched on. Ordinary life continuing exactly as it always had. Eventually, I picked up my keys. What happens now? Victoria asked. I looked toward the road ahead of us. Now people become who they choose to be. It was the most honest answer I had. I walked toward my truck and paused before opening the door. Then I looked back one final time at the backyard where everything had unfolded. The jokes, the assumptions, the laughter, the truth. None of it felt important anymore. Because the real victory was not proving anyone wrong. The real victory was knowing who I was even when nobody else did. The water dried in a few hours. The lesson lasted much longer. And maybe that is the strange thing about respect. You cannot demand it. You cannot buy it. You cannot force people to give it to you. But eventually, character reveals itself. So does arrogance. And when that happens, the truth usually needs no help at all. If you watch this story all the way to the end, I would genuinely like to know your thoughts. Do you think Cole was right to keep his success private? Or should he have revealed the truth years earlier? Share your perspective in the comments because every viewpoint tells its own story. And if stories about resilience, betrayal, hard lessons, and quiet justice resonate with you, consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey. Sometimes the strongest people are not the loudest ones in the room. Sometimes they are simply the ones who know exactly who they are when nobody else does.